The principles that we've been learning so far apply to all forms of Chinese physical culture and actually to martial arts beyond that. This is what we mean by the science of Chinese physical culture. So, as an intellectual exercise, let's look at this posture that we've been looking at so far, but this time just done on the spot. And imagine you're just seeing it for the first time. And you need to identify, first of all, what context it's using, or more importantly, first of all, you've got to give the dog a treat, but then identify which context it's using. You've got to identify how it's using oppositional force, how much the posture is curtailed and why, and how is the posture being set. Which foot is the dominant set? What kind of routing is it using? What kind of articulated movement is it using? Is it using phased movement? The Yiquan method helps us, not just physically, but conceptually, to crack open all of the mysteries of different forms of Chinese physical culture. So let's go through it. And the first thing that we identify is the movement of the hips. And we see that the hips are moving away from one another, and that tells us that this context is open. Or in the old five elements theory, this would be wood because wood expands. And for those people who think that Wang Xiangjia didn't use five element theory, I'm telling you he did. It's one of the very first things that he did in terms of modifying Xing Yiquan theory. And what he says is that although it's not unreasonable to have a counter to a strike, it is unreasonable to think that in the chaos of a fight you'll be able to work with some kind of complex theory that says, well, this is a fire technique, so I need to counter that with a water technique. You just won't have enough time. So instead, he does what he always does. He reinterprets or he re-understands the original meaning of this concept. And he sees it as representing much more fundamental principles of movement that then can form intuitively. With enough training, you can use them to form intuitively into techniques that you can use in the heat of the moment. And he talks about this being a unification of the elements as opposed to this concepts of separate elements. And Yao Zhongzhen says this is one of the things that he carries with him all his life. He gets it right early and it doesn't really change, but what does change is he abandons this kind of arcane Xing Yiquan terminology of the five elements, and instead he starts using the much more straightforward Tai Chi Chuan terminology of open, close, rise and sink. And using that paradigm, I can then see that this posture doesn't just use open, it also clearly uses rise. So it's very much like a jab. It's approximately 50-50 between open and rise. And that can tell me lots of things. So for example, if I want to copy this posture, I've started to unravel the blueprint. But also, if I see someone doing a posture that I think is wrong, for example, I saw someone teaching the basic Yiquan jab using close, which isn't the orthodox way of doing it. It's not necessarily beyond the Yiquan paradigm, but it's absolutely not the most effective or powerful way of using a jab in Yiquan. So I can spot problems with people's movement, and from there I can understand their level. But my experience tells me that this posture is being done correctly. And not only does this help you learn and understand Wushu better, you can spot these things in other people's movements, and you can actually on the fly intuitively take advantage of your understanding of whether they are using open, close, rise or sink. And Wang Xiangjia says, watch very carefully what your opponent's doing. I mean, sometimes he talks about this idea, it's not actually from Wang Xiangjia, it's a much older idea of kind of gazing at your opponent like you're not really looking at them. But when he's talking about technical details, he says explicitly and specifically, scrutinize your opponent's movements, see how their structure is being formed, and that will give you a lot of information about where they are strong and where they're vulnerable. And then following that, the next most obvious thing is how the posture is being rooted and set. So we can see clearly straight away that it's using a pivot root. And we know now that in Yiquan there's a lot more to pivot roots than just the very basic discussion that sometimes people have around this concept. We know, for example, that it's helping to contribute towards the inclusion of rise into the posture. And if we take a closer look at the lead leg, we can see that this posture is very similar to empty stance in traditional Wushu. So it's not just something that's been bolted on from outside. And it's the same for exactly the same reason, that it contributes to the generation of force, the balancing of the posture, and the smoother transition into the use of open. And one of the first things that I always do if I want to assess someone's level is to look at how they're using their feet, to look at how they're using footwork. So here, for example, I can see that the pivot root is pointing towards, or the whole leg is pointing towards the hip point. And from a photograph, I would assume that this is the lock point. And then when I see the posture in motion, then I can see that it is the lock point. And that tells me that the person doing the posture understands the use of lock points. So it's relaxed movement into a lock point, and that tells me that they understand about force transmission. And that puts their posture very much within that category that's very often called Neji Chuan. Shaolin Chuan, for example, doesn't have this kind of curtailed movement. It has big extended postures out into Shaolin Chuan style lock point. So curtailed movement, correct use of contexts, dog flapping his ears, foot in line with the hip point. All of these things tell me about the posture and how it's stacked and how I would do it if I was to copy this posture, and whether I think the person doing the posture is doing it correctly or incorrectly. And next, if I didn't get this intuitively and I wanted to check it so that I could copy the posture or check the person's level, I can look at the routing and the setting, and I can see that it lifts up on the front foot and that pushes back down into the back foot, which is an orthodox set for a lead hand posture, just like a jab. It doesn't always have to be done like that, and it won't always be done like that. When you're doing things like bag work or sparring, everything changes with movement and power. That's inevitable, but these are what we call the template postures, like the perfect way of doing it, just as a single movement with no pressure, and from there it becomes adapted into ever more complex situations where we've got to ever more bend the rules. Next, you can look at the articulation and where that articulation is coming in. So in this case, it's clearly in the lead hand using articulated force. And then the final thing I want to know is about the overall complexity of the body movement. Does it use a phased movement? So what's the count? Does one part of the body move, then another part of the body move slightly afterwards? In this case, no, it's all just done on a count of one. It's one explosive movement up into the lock point. And added into that is the oppositional force, which you can see really clearly with the right arm coming back, and that leads the whole body into open. So it's using open and rise, but it leads the whole body into open. And we can also see pretty clearly that it uses screwing force to get the extra posture back. So the left fist in this case is twisting down, thumbs twisting in, and using screwing force to get that extra zing onto the movement. And that's it, well done. We've done our first breakdown of the key elements of a movement. There's lots of other things, minor things we can look at, the angle of the head, chin tucked in and so on. But those are all the big things that we use to understand, critique or copy a movement that we see and we like and we think we can include into our Yiquan practice. And also we can use these concepts to take a technique that's not quite within the Yiquan paradigm, but we can modify it and bring it in. So for example, bringing in Western boxing techniques, this is exactly how Western boxing techniques were brought into Yiquan, by using this paradigm. But it doesn't stop there. We can bring in techniques from anywhere. That's how we create cultural sets. We take the quintessence principles of Wushu and then we bring them into contact with and merge them with different kinds of paradigms, physical movement, culture paradigms. Okay, so let's have a test. Imagine you saw this person practicing and you wanted to analyse what they were practicing based on all of the ideas that we've just looked at. How would you assess what's going on here? So a different posture we can look at that uses some elements that we've looked at before but haven't necessarily discussed here. How would you break this down using this overall conceptualization that we've been building? How would you take it apart, identify the different elements, and then identify what's being taught here? And once you can do this, you can start learning just by watching people's movement. Good luck with the exam.